Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second day of Interact, IAB Europe's annual Congress. My name is Constantine Kamaras, and I have the honor of being IAB Europe's Chairman Emeritus and the Chair of the Interact Program Advisory Board. A warm welcome to those of you that only joined us today, and a welcome back to those that were with us also yesterday. Now, as most of you have seen, I'm sure in our communications and our website, the theme of this year's event is the Digital New Deal, as we aim to take stock to what is needed to ensure a sustainable and innovative future for the digital advertising and marketing industry. Now, across 3 afternoons, starting yesterday, continuing today, and wrapping up tomorrow, we'll be looking at all the 3 pillars of IAB Europe activity, namely yesterday, industry initiatives, today, policy and data protection, and tomorrow, standards and frameworks. As most of you will know, IAB Europe is the European level association for the digital marketing and advertising ecosystem, and through its membership of national IABs and companies from the media, marketing, and technology sector that are active across Europe. There's corporate members as well, and our mission is to lead political representation and promote industry collaboration across Europe. And one of the ways we do that is through events, and none is more important than an annual Congress, Interact, which hopefully is virtual for the last time, and as of next year, we'll be meeting again in person like we always did. We are very much grateful to our main sponsors, OneTrust, Double Verify, and Relevant Yield, and our supporting sponsors, Google and Magnite. And today we have a stellar lineup of speakers, moderators, and panelists for our sessions. We will kick off with a panel discussion on the importance of transparency within the DSA. Then we will move to a fireside chat with Simon McDougall, the Deputy Commissioner, Regulatory Innovative Technology from the ICO in the UK. And then who will be joining Tony Fian, our CEO, and IAB UK's Policy Director, Christy Dainey, to discuss the ICO's priorities, including the recent joint statement with the CMA on competition and data protection law. We will then be moving on to the CNIL and the priorities of the CNIL concerning, in connection with digital advertising. We expect to have a very interesting presentation there. Then a panel discussion on the learnings from the GDPR enforcement in the context of the e-privacy dialogues. And of course, we will be concluding with the closing keynote from Ms. Vera Eurova, the Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency. I think it's going to be a fascinating couple of hours, 2 hours, 2 hours and a half. And if you'd like to have more information on how to get involved with our work and join us in our mission in serving the digital marketing and advertising ecosystem and shaping the future of our industry, please do connect with Helen Massad, our CMO, or Lauren Wakefield, who heads up our marketing and industry programs, to receive more information. Now, before we kick off, just like yesterday, we just want to establish the shareholder breakdown of the audience with a very quick poll. As you know, IAB Europe is an industry-wide organization representing brands, agencies, ad tech, publishers, broadcasters, and solutions providers. So there is a poll that has popped up on your screen. Please take a few seconds to answer so we can get an overview of the breakdown of the audience. And if you are in the other category, would like to know what your role is, so please add in the chat box. It's always great to see the great diversity we have always in our audience. I should also stress that you can actively participate in today's event, as each panel will be followed by audience Q&A. So if you have questions for today's panelists, please submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. So thank you for completing the poll, and the results are in, and it's very interesting. We have advertisers with 6%, agencies 13%, ad tech with close to a quarter, publishers close to a quarter. We have policymakers and regulators, civil society, academia at 7%, media, of course, and other, and we're looking forward to seeing what other is. So thank you for completing the poll, and on to quickly, swiftly, as time keeping is of essence in such virtual events. We will move to our first session, in which our CEO, Ms. Townsend Fian, will provide a short overview on the DSA before moderating a panel of experts who will share their thoughts on the importance of transparency within the DSA. Good afternoon, Townie, and over to you.
Hi, Constantine. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Loud and clear.
Now I'm set up. Thanks very much. Thanks for the handover. I'd like to introduce my panelists. Whoops, that wasn't supposed to happen. And then run through a couple of slides about the Digital Services Act proposal. The proposal is 89 pages, and it seems like there was an outside chance that not everybody attending today had read the whole thing, and so we thought we'd put everyone on a sort of equal information level at the start, and then we'll have our discussion. So first and most important, my panelists. I will start with Marisa Jimenez Martin, Director of Public Policy and Deputy Head of EU Affairs at Facebook in Brussels. So Marisa could turn on her video and wave, or not, as she wishes. Stefan Rangelovic, Director, Digital Risk and Brand Safety Group EMEA. And Ries Noordke, Senior Vice President, Technology and Data at Bertelsmann, and who also sits on our board. So I hope everybody can see everybody. I will now if the team could throw up the slides, I will, I think I have like 5 of them. And it's best if you put put the participants down at the bottom of your screen. So I thought it was interesting to compare DSA and DMA, or put DSA a little bit in the context of these 2 proposals that are often talked about together. It came out roughly, at the same time, and were discussed a lot together in the course of last year. So the Digital Services Act has the objective to ensure a safe, predictable, trusted online environment, and it clarifies liability of intermediary service providers for illegal content, products, and services, and imposes certain obligations on them to improve user safety and societal safety. It's also about illegal hate speech. It has an essentially B2C focus. It has arisen in part out of a long reflection on revision of the e-commerce directive. So it's essentially B2C consumer protection focus. And the stakeholders that are most evidently impacted are intermediary service providers, with sort of subsets of that broad group of intermediary service providers comprising hosting service providers, online platforms, and very large online platforms, the smallest subset. The DMA, by contrast, has a bit more of a market structure focus, a B2B focus, and less of a B2C or consumer outcome focus. The purpose of the DMA is to ensure contestable and fair markets for the provision of a set of services that are identified as core platform services. As I say, it's B2B, and the main players impacted are the so-called gatekeepers, and then companies that look like set to become gatekeepers between a hinterland of commercial suppliers and a market of consumers who look like becoming keepers in the future, in the near future. So the two proposals are different and complementary, and we're going to just talk about the DSA today. So next slide, please. So as I said, the main players impacted by the DSA proposal are these intermediate service providers, and within that broad group, there are these three subgroups: hosting service providers, online platforms, and very large online platforms. And the proposed regulation sets out a set of quite rather minimal obligations for the broad group of intermediate service providers, and then sort of increasingly adds on to that minimum level of requirements some extra requirements for each of the other other groups, all of which are cumulative. So the very large online platforms have the largest number of obligations. Next slide, please. So very quickly, the set of obligations that accrue to all intermediate service providers are, as I say, reasonably minimal. They need to designate a point of contact and a legal representative in the EU if they are targeting EU consumers. They need to ensure that their terms and conditions mention any content moderation policies. So that means policies that govern how they might take down or control content that they host. And they need to publish annual reports on any ways in which they, any of this content moderation, any examples of where they've interfered in something that was posted for whatever reason. So then the second set of obligations, which accrues to that second group of hosting service providers, this group needs to set up mechanisms to allow third parties, that could be a private person or an organization, to notify them if there appears to be illegal content on their service. And then if the hosting service provider takes action to remove that content, it needs to explain to the person who flagged the content and the person who posted the content why it was removed. And then decisions of that type that are taken need to be publicized so that everybody understands going forward what the rules are. So then the third set of obligations accrues to the online platforms, in addition to the previous two. And the online platforms then have to set up internal complaint handling systems. They need to be willing to participate in out-of-court dispute settlement. They need to be willing to prioritize trusted flaggers. When they get complaints coming in, they need to give priority to the ones that are coming from officially designated trusted flaggers. They need to ensure traceability of traders, so know your customer. They need to publicly report the numbers of disputes that are submitted and settled, numbers of suspensions imposed, and any use made of automated content moderation as opposed to human intervention. And then there's some obligations with respect to online advertising transparency, which we'll get to. And then finally, there is the set of obligations that, in addition to all the others, accrue to the VLOPs. I don't know if anyone calls them that, but I've been calling them that, which is risk assessment and mitigation, independent audits of their compliance by a third party, information to be provided about the parameters that are used in algorithmic recommender systems, and options for private users to modify any parameters that are used in connection with personalization of their experience, creation of repositories of ads shown during the past 12 months, and then codes of conduct that go beyond the online advertising transparency requirements cited in the paragraph above. So most of these obligations actually don't superficially have anything to do with advertising, but just to sort of set the scene. Next slide, please. With respect to advertising, there are basically three articles: Article 24, Article 30, and Article 36. Next slide. then I just have little breakdown of what each of those articles says. So Article 24 just builds on requirements in the existing e-privacy directive, which already requires that an advertisement be evident that an ad is an ad, that a commercial communication is a commercial communication. But the new requirements are that it must be made evident to a consumer on whose behalf the advertisement has been displayed, and then consumers ought also to get meaningful information about why they got the ad, about the main parameters used in order to determine why they got the ad, who gets which ad. Next slide. And then there is Article 30 then concerns the very large online platforms that have to do, have some specific advertising related requirements. They must maintain repositories that contain all the ads they have shown during the previous 12 months, the natural or legal persons on whose behalf each ad was shown, how long each ad ran, whether the ads were targeted, and if so, according to what logic, and then information on just numbers of people, anonymized numbers of people who saw each ad. And then I think this is the last slide, Article 36, interestingly, encourages industry to develop codes of conduct that would provide for transparency about advertising that goes even beyond the elements that I just cited in these two previous articles. And those codes should lay down how information is to be communicated to users, and how the information required for the repositories is to be put together and stored. So I think that's the last slide. See if there's anything else. No, voila. So so with that scene setting, I thought I would let me get the get the conversation going. I'd be interested. Maybe I'll start with Stevan. So as I said, it's not in the main about advertising, the DSA, but it's obviously part of the story, presumably in part because of the perceived connection between advertising and online disinformation. I'd be interested to know whether you feel the transparency obligations that we just looked at in those three articles seem to be the right ones. Does looking from where you sit, does the inclusion of advertising in the DSA proposal that we've seen thus far seem to be the right one, and is it even maybe an opportunity for the industry?
Thank you, Dominique. That's a big question. So when I think about advertising in DSA, I think of two things, two columns, if you like. One is the content of advertising, what does the advertising carry, and two is what kind of data are you using to inform the advertising targeting. I personally am not surprised because advertising is included in the proposal, because we have seen in the past that there have been abuses of the system in both ways. That does not mean that is the general industry practice. It's just that some highlighted bad practices that happened may have brought the regulator, to introduce those requirements. Are they going to help? We already have quite a lot of legal frameworks in place, and also industry self-regulation that we're going to speak potentially a bit later, that address specifically many of these things. But nevertheless, I stand firm that I do think that the industry should embrace more transparency. I don't think we should be asking a question whether we should embrace it, but how. And potentially that's a real question: how to ensure that we don't have the inflation of information and transparency so much that we fatigue people into not reading and not understanding and simply not caring. So yes, transparency, potentially just seeing the cross match with other stuff.
That's good. That's a good phrase, inflation of information. How about Gys? How does it look from where you sit? How do you see the inclusion of advertising? And is this proposal of particular interest to Bertelsmann? And what do you think about what's been slotted in, at least from the commission side, to do with advertising?
Well, Tani, I believe that it's been already quite a long ride in terms of trying to get many of the legislative elements actually come into place. And if we sort of sit here and now look at DSA isolated, I think we would not really make any meat here. As Bertelsmann, I can only say we've got a lot of publishing businesses on the one side with RTL and many other, let's say, media businesses, but also e-commerce and services business going alongside there. So I look at this always very much on the complete value chain, and there we see a lot of different impacts through this. So actually, it's very important that DSA is making this approach, that we have this kind of enhanced liability regime, and that we are trying to sort of get the digital space, a really trustworthy place. So I think it's a really key element here. I do believe that overall, especially in the digital advertising sector, as Stefan was also going into this now, I believe that we've got too many areas at the moment afloat that makes it very complicated for us actually as a publisher or any other offering in the digital space to actually come to terms and actually offering this detailed granularity as you sort of was just going through the paragraphs. I believe that if we are honest to each other, the user still doesn't really know how to follow the tracking elements of advertising, but he does want to have some kind of control. So I would sort of love to take a step back at some given point to actually say, what tools do you really need to give the user and the consumer so that he actually really understands on what's going on? So I think also mentioning what Stefan was heading towards, I think we need to sort of make this understandable and comprehensible for the user, and then we actually are able to make this usable also for the customer and make the monetization model that all the publishers need. So I don't think it's the greatest idea to sort of make doom and gloom about targeted advertising in this space, now part of the DSA. But I do understand the discontent of the regulator, as we as an industry need to make a better offering there that is not creating new gatekeepers, but actually making the choice and the value offering clear to the consumer. And then I think give them the controls, as well as having controls actually as an industry for the bad actors and the shady parts of the business that we also want to not have within our ranks. I think that's the clear message of the DSA.
Thanks. Thanks. A lot in there too. Marissa, from Facebook's perspective, are there points you'd like to add to what the colleagues have already called out?
Yes, thank you. I think that they both have touched upon very important points. I'd just like to add to that the fact that advertising is part of the DSA also is an opportunity for this sector. And I think that this is not only for ad tech or publishers or advertisers or tech companies or platforms, it's for all of us to really take responsibility as a sector, as the advertising ecosystem once again, to bring those solutions to the table. I do think, for instance, on something that has happened today, which is the EC recommendations on misinformation. So for people who are not familiar and watching now, really they're trying, the Commission is giving some guidance as how harmful content like misinformation should be addressed in Europe. It's not legislation yet, it's still self-regulation, but it is really a step before that DSA comes into practice. And what's really interesting about that is the focus that the European Commission is making, not to say there's one single part that has all the problems. It's not only about the platforms, it is about the ecosystem. It is about the brands and the ad tech and the advertisers and the platforms. So I do think we should see this as a great opportunity for the sector from now until those provisions are actually adopted, probably in a year or two from now.
It's I didn't mention in the opening. I thought at the beginning of sort of setting these two proposals, DSA and DMA, also in the context of e-privacy and GDPR, because obviously a huge amount of information is communicated to users either directly in consent UIs or other UIs to establish a legal basis for processing of personal data under GDPR, accessing advice under e-privacy. There's a ton of information goes out either directly in the UI or in the privacy policy. And I think indeed, if you sort of look in the detail of what's required under Articles 13 and 14 GDPR, you could certainly derive a lot of what seems to be being looked for now in the DSA. Are there other efforts that any of you would like to call out, either that your companies or others in your space in the ecosystem are involved in? Other efforts to provide transparency beyond the exhaustive mind-numbing amount of information that's required by privacy and data protection law? Are there good examples anyone would like to call out about information disclosures that are a little bit more in the neighborhood of the, why did I get this ad, and these non-strictly speaking privacy and data protection disclosures?
Maybe I can start. I think that, you said, let's talk about new innovations other than why are you seeing this ad, or we can talk a little bit more about that. But I would really like to really call the attention that these might seem innovations that are deja vu, that everyone knows about, but it has taken so much for this industry to get to that point where we, a few years ago, who would have said that a user could have information about why that user is receiving that ad and the exact reasons why there in one click next to on the same screen with no other burden than that. I think that the entire industry has gone in that journey to provide not only user control and more transparency, but a key thing here, which is the user experience also in ads. And I think that there's still a lot to do, but I wouldn't, I think that this is a really, really big step forward that the industry has done in the last years. I'd like to just touch upon one point in terms of innovations, which is on transparency, which is the ads library in the case of Facebook. And I think that some of the provisions that we're seeing on the DSA today with respect to transparency and advertising probably also are based, or the spirit of it is also based or founded on some of the things that the industry is already doing. In our case, Facebook with the ads library, both for political ads and for commercial ads. It's true that the DSA goes a little bit beyond in that it no longer distinguishes, at least at this stage, between political advertising and commercial advertising, but the aspect of having an ad library where people can see the ads associated to a page, and including in political ads who that ad comes from, and the fact that we have an authorization process to give fundamental or essential information about the location, the audience, the amount spent in the area of political advertising. It is an innovation that comes from industry, a best practice from a company, then an industry practice, and then now we have in a draft law. So it's interesting to see that these things don't come out of the blue. They really are built on what we as an industry have tried before.
Thank you. Chris or Stefan, other good examples, other best practices of information disclosure, either in the privacy space or non-privacy?
I can jump in here. I mean, from my perspective, I think also from IAB Europe's perspective, I think we've given a lot of emphasis on creating the transparency on consent framework over the last years, and I think that is one of these very sort of the lighthouse pillar kind of projects that are kind of, really been created sort of to make sure that from a back end perspective, the industry is able to transact the data. I think what is the bigger challenge actually now looking forward is also making that kind of recognizable also from a front end, from a user perspective. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done from each of the players. And I would wish that we are able to find a better common ground to actually make this transparent, because it is quite a let's say a tug of war, I would say, in terms of the interest between all the different players in this space. But I think we see this now coming so close and becoming so urgent that there need to be more elements of usability out there, so that the user really has the choice. And I can also just repeat maybe, or sort of throw in the European NetID Foundation that we've been part of actually at the right from the beginning with several other European companies out there, and actually making, especially starting in Germany, where the user has a login that he can control across different properties. And I think that's a very neutral let's say foundation that is kind of organizing this, and taking such a concept, for instance, would be also something that could be also a part across the ecosystem with all the big players, and actually involved to actually make the user this choice that, as I was just mocking a little bit around the different, let's say, how long have I been viewing this advertisement, or as Marissa was saying, advertising library. I think if we look at it, it needs to be even simpler than that. I think the users just want to really have very, very sort of, basic tools that they are able to see why I'm being tracked, or where does it come from, kind of switch it off if I want to do this somehow. And I think there we are still not there yet on having that concept that we can give to the user. So I think that's where we need to put our heads together. Taking different initiatives that we have, the regulatory, self-regulatory, let's say, elements, the code of conduct that is also being discussed on these various levels, but actually make it an offer towards the consumer.
Stefan, anything to add from Group M's perspective? Did we lose Stefan? It can happen, even at the best events. But he'll probably he'll hopefully dial back in. Ironically, as we make these investments and struggle to strike the balance between comprehensiveness and specificity, on the one hand, and intuitiveness and simplicity and user friendliness on the other, and something that even the data protection authorities seem to bring different perspectives to, and in spite of the immense amount of effort that goes into this work, the DSA, as you guys know, has become the opportunity or the occasion of a debate about a blanket prohibition on targeted advertising, on personalization. I think there are different terms thrown around. I think there's no clear definition, and that might be sort of an issue that makes the impact even worse than it's originally intended. Does it seem a surprise to you that this proposal with these rather positive provisions that suggest an important continuing role for advertising in the funding and provision of intermediary services? Does it surprise you that this discussion would trigger a interest in a ban? And do you think the people who are principally in the European Parliament, who are taking the opportunity to suggest a ban, understand what the impact would be on European media and on the provision of other valuable services? How about I know, Stefan, welcome back. Did you hear the whole question, or just part of it?
I'm afraid I did not. I apologize. My laptop just decided to restart. due to systematic error. So
Right.
apologies.
No trouble. So how about one of the other colleagues? And does it surprise you that we got e-privacy discussions and apparently mostly converging on a sane outcome that would allow life to go on, and DPAs in the context of GDPR implementation also converging on an approach to cookie walls that leaves some space to run businesses. Does it surprise you that we're having a discussion about a ban in the context of the DSA now, and what do you think we can do about it? Marissa.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I think with the okay. It doesn't surprise me. I don't think it doesn't surprise a lot of people, but at the same time, it just makes us reflect once again about the fact that the objectives that this ban wants to address are valid objectives. So there's legitimate concerns. What's not legitimate, what is not proportionate is the solution proposed for this. So I think that we really need to distinguish between that, the ban as a solution and the objectives that it's trying to address. I think that we have discussed targeted advertising for a long time, for many years, all of us, in the context of privacy and data protection. Among other things, because that was the piece of legislation that really was the first one to regulate the online world. So everything was seen of it, right? Including myself. We all saw it from the personal data or perspective. But the truth of the matter is that when we look at this in the experience online, the concerns are about manipulation, the concerns about bias, and the concerns are about privacy. And I think that we should not underestimate the concerns in the public and the concerns of policymakers. Having said that, we have to have the ability to come up with solutions and together as an industry be able to explain why the solution is not to ban targeted advertising, but to make sure that there's no manipulation, that there's no bias, and there's no privacy violations. In that sense, we have an opportunity to continue, first of all, to give us rules to ourselves and also within the context of the DSA, but to really continue to focus as well on user control, transparency, and the user. I come back to the same concept because I think it's important, which is user experience, a better user experience for our users. Because when we look at the study of IAB Europe, and we ask people, we've done it a few times, right? We've asked people, what would you like? What do you think about ads? Well, the first thing they say is that they like ads that are relevant. They hate ads that are not relevant, right? So it brings us back to the 90s with non-relevant ads that no one liked. So first of all, people like relevant ads, and that's targeted ads. The second point is that they prefer a world where there's when they see the internet that is still essentially for free, in that you don't pay for the service per se. That doesn't mean that no one else pays for the service, like in television or cable, right? But television, the free television is not free, indeed. But you know what I mean. So in that sense, if we keep asking users that they do believe in advertising that is relevant, but let's just make that advertising relevant work for them. And we do know that our small businesses are heavily dependent on this. I want to say that and the last thing I want to say is that when we see these calls for bans, which we're seeing in the Parliament, some of the members of the European Parliament that actually have signed to these petitions, then when they talk to you individually, the majority of them do not have this perspective. But we have to make it a lot easier for the public and policymakers to really defend the business model. So we have to make more efforts to make this also simpler for them to defend.
I agree, and to somehow pick apart the perceived connections or elucidate the perceived connections between online advertising and online disinformation and hate speech and the amalgamation of these things in a way that makes one reach for extreme solutions. Stefan, how about you on the proposed ban and what the smart way is to get to an outcome that's better for everyone, including users?
Well, I think Marisa was so comprehensive. I wouldn't really have anything more to add apart from there is probably something that we as the industry are not doing enough and are not strong enough on. And if these kind of proposals are being discussed. And going back to the first question, is this an opening, another opportunity for us? Yes, it is, because if you have a regulator that is discussing this, the ban of a model that proved economically sound, yes, it was misused, then we have an issue, and probably the best way to address this issue through smart transparency, I believe, which is better user experience, clearer information, and probably the way the ultimate obstacle we are facing there is probably that when we are designing all this stuff as the industry, we go straight to the law, and law is very prescriptive. So when you put everything that the law tells you to put out, you get a very, very long list of information, and again, sometimes it can be I'm going to repeat this, inflation of information. So it's all about smart transparency. There you are, another sentence to remember.
Yes. All these quotable quotes. Well done. Please, anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a, this issue that I was also talking about, this kind of impatience that the regulator seems to have, because if you just look maybe at consent layers, sort of layering on top of each other, they don't really create that transparency maybe that a lawmaker would like to see. And I have to agree that that's something we need to clean up as an industry, so that we actually take it step by step. If I actually just look at the study that what Marisa was just mentioning, I mean, just take the phrasing, for instance, even as we sort of discuss now here, Apple's ATT kind of tracking, let's say, window. If it would say, are you allowing tracking, but would pay for the service instead, because ultimately if you are not allowing tracking, this service will die as a publisher, because it's simply not going to monetize it. I think if you just think about it till the end, I think then a ban of that type of advertising is not particularly smart in terms of bringing this over. It is important that we are able, as a publisher, specifically in the news area. I mean, we have a lot of, let's say, journalistic content from RTL side and from the magazine publishing business of G&J, for instance. And these services are simply not the ones that a user would sort of initially would pay, or sort of a big sum. So you would actually die, the pluralism in Europe would die and starve out due to the disability. So I think you need to really look at the consequences, and then you would come up to maybe some smarter solutions in terms of making it more clear why tracking or targeted advertising or addressable television, for instance, actually makes sense, because the user is actually now more and more in a digital age being used to actually getting more customized and catered for solutions. I mean, free TV, as Marisa says, is maybe ad-funded TV, but as the same as Facebook is also, let's say, an ad-funded business. The question is really, how do you make that service really and audience stickiness, work? And that actually is a consumer choice, because he would not like to watch TV as a whole, or sort of have an online video or a social network kind of in front of a user, if it was not adequately sort of served to him in terms of his offering and service. So I think we have this sort of joint line of interest here that a user needs to be satisfied with the service provided, and I think that's where the regulator needs to give us also a little bit of trust in actually knowing what we want to actually offer our customers. And in the return, we actually need to give the regulator the comfort that the user has the control and we are transparent towards them, and that we are also able to sanction bad behavior as an industry. I think that's really important. Similarly, as it then goes into the content area for illegal or harmful content, etc., we have a responsibility. We as a publisher take this responsibility. We've done this all along in actually making quality content in there, and the same applies to the advertising. We have to sort of have the right advertising and the good advertising that is ready for the customer and for the customers of Group M or anyone, so that we actually create this bridge.
Well, you've all eloquently made the case, and I hope we'd be able to enlist you for the continuing outreach to the EU institutions over the coming months on the DSA. And indeed, the other files. So, but for the moment, we need to wrap up. Thank you very much for your time, Elisa Jimenez, Chris Nölke, and Stefan Rangelovic. And I believe we have to move on to the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Marisa, Reese, and Stefan, for this distinctly incisive look into the transparency in digital advertising and how this translates in the context of the EU legislative discussion on prospective DSA. Now, Tony, again, thank you, but stay where you are as we're now moving into our fireside chat between yourself, Simon McDougall, Deputy Commissioner, Regulatory Innovation and Technology from the ICO in the UK, and Christy Dainey-Ney, Policy Director of IAB UK, to discuss the ICO's priorities. So a big welcome to Simon and Christy, and thank you for your time. And back over to you, Tony.
Here. Well, welcome and thanks so much for joining us, Simon and Christy both. We could use a fireside in Brussels today. It's about 12 degrees, and I was watching my border collie get covered in hail about 20 minutes ago. But it's all virtual, so we'll have to pretend. The format of this, Simon, is going to be it's a double interrogation. Christy and I are going to do a tandem, pursuant to which she puts a question and I put a question. If we were all sitting in a room, your head would be spinning, but you're at a safe distance. And I'll just I'll let Christy kick off since she's the guest, and we'll see how much we can wedge into the remaining 14 minutes or whatever it is.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, Simon, and hello, everybody. I will crack on because time is of the essence. So let's get started. I think, Simon, we first wanted to kind of touch on privacy and competition. There's obviously a lot of policy and regulatory focus on the intersection of these two areas at the moment in digital advertising, notably due to the work of the UK CMA, but also the EU's DMA and DSA proposals. Some people suggest that a consequence of this, as regulators to start to look at how the steps being taken by some larger players that are aimed at improving privacy, how they could impact competition, there's a suggestion from some people that actually we'll see privacy enforcement taking a backseat to competition enforcement over the coming sort of 18, 24 months. But then conversely, the joint ICO-CMA statement that you published last week emphasised actually that in your view, competition and privacy interventions should work together and can work together. So how do you think we should see this kind of intersection and its implications for the digital advertising industry?
Well, good questions all, and thanks to you, Christy, thanks to Tony, and thanks to the IAB family for inviting me. I would break that down into a couple of different points. The first is probably the the health warning on all of this, because in a minute I'll probably go on to stuff which is the things you'd expect me to say, which is about how we don't see the two as being in conflict with one another. So I will say that good stuff, and I do believe that good stuff. It is important to say, to keep in mind when you're talking with any regulator around the world, that regulators are creatures of statute. And as such, we are driven by the laws that we have been asked to regulate, to promote, to enforce. And we quite rightly can't step outside of the laws and regulations and the policy objectives that we have in those areas. And if we are, then quite rightly, we get legal challenge, which happens all the time. People say, well, this regulator is going beyond their jurisdiction. So we always have to be very careful about that. It would mean we would lose cases. It means that we would not use funds appropriately. So even though I'm going to say a few things about how I see these areas as not being in kind of really a big clash of conflict, it is important to say that both the CMA and the ICO, and this goes for regulators around the world, in the end, we have to fulfill our own policy objectives. And if that means we had to pursue things separately, we could still go and do so. There's no, so in terms of, well, privacy enforcement versus competition enforcement, there's no kind of after you, I'll do this, you won't do this. If we wanted to, both regulators could say, well, this is a harm, this is a breach of regulation in our world, therefore we'll do something about it. And indeed, they'd have to do that because of the way they're set up. So that's important to say. There's no magic wand for addressing that. The way to address that is for governments to change primary legislation if they want to direct regulators through their democratic processes to do things differently. So that's the first thing to say. What we are primarily doing right now in the UK with both this joint statement between us and the CMA and also the work we're doing with the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which is all part of the same kind of big effort, is trying to make sure that we best coordinate our efforts in our current scopes. And so the statement was the product of lots of really hard work. If people haven't seen this statement, it's a lot of detail in there, 30 pages talking about this area. This is not just a 2-paragraph, let's all play nicely together statement. It's a meaningful piece of work. Trying to explore the overlapping area around advertising and ad tech and the like between privacy and competition. And trying to say, okay, given our respective scopes, how does this all work? And what we have found through doing that work is, we're not saying there aren't any tensions, we're not saying there aren't any issues, but as we work through the issues, we often found much larger synergies and areas of alignment in our objectives than we found differences. So I don't recognize a big conflict or I kind of need to prioritize one enforcement over the other. What we've really worked out is as we've understood one another's languages and cultures and policy objectives, we're actually very much aligned.
Great, thank you, Simon. I have to apologise, I've got sun in my eyes, ironically. I can't complain about the sun because the weather here is also dreadful, but apologies if my face is looking strange.
No, you're fine.
Townie, perhaps we'll move on to your question just in the interest of time.
Yeah, so I see we're running out. I have a question that you could take a UK perspective on, but it's a theme that arises elsewhere. So we hear, and I think it's even stated in the DSA proposal or the DMA proposal, that the GDPR has actually aggravated the market structure issues that are evident in our sector. Would you agree with that? And I'm curious about whether you agree with that. And the other sort of narrative that one hears is that that is perceived as a sort of policy error that needs to be corrected. And so we may be entering a period where the emphasis is going to be on economic policy, competition, and less on privacy compliance. yeah, and that's a narrative that you know, in some ways seems counterproductive, you know, in light of other aspects of our current environment. So yeah, any comments on either of those thoughts?
Lots of comments, and there's a whole conference to be had out of those statements on themselves. So I'll keep myself limited. I don't agree with the initial premise that GDPR itself has exacerbated those tensions for two reasons. Firstly, there's an awful lot of complication there between different factors, different market trends, different players in the market. And we're very conscious as a privacy regulator, not only that in the digital world we're working alongside other regulators, but also we're not driving this market. There are many other factors, and I'm sure much of this conference is focused on what's happening with Apple and Google and what's happening elsewhere in the market. There's a whole range of trends. And our part is just one cog in that wheel. So to say that GDPR has done that is I think a bit simplistic. Have I seen sometimes people mentioning GDPR in a way which seems confused and maybe using privacy as a way to advance a preferred business model to another business model? I've seen that in many sectors, and I've seen that with other bits of regulation as well. And lots of organizations will always lean on regulation that is useful to them in their particular markets. And I don't think the advertising market is any different there. So I think, and the third thing I'd say is GDPR is 3 years old. It's a very new piece of regulation still, and from a economist's point of view, it's too early to draw those conclusions. So it's something I think we've got to be alive to, and I think we are very keen at the ICO, where we've always had, since the Deregulation Act in 2015, we've always actually had ourselves an obligation in the UK to consider economic growth as part of our consideration. It's not as if we're being alien to that concept, but we do need to kind of, to go forward, make sure we're thinking holistically about our objectives and other regulators' policy objectives and general economic and growth objectives, because there's a whole range of factors there to think about.
Simon, you've practically teed up my next question almost perfectly. So that was either accident or design. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of back to the UK, I guess, specifically, and how the UK might position itself with respect to privacy over the coming sort of midterm, I guess, 3 to 5 years. It was interesting, the DCMS Secretary of State, so that's the department that's responsible for both data and data protection and digital, recently described the ICO as one of the UK's most important economic regulators, which was quite an interesting use of language. And we've seen the UK government's national data strategy as well, setting out the government's vision for both high standards of data protection for the public and avoiding unnecessary barriers to data use business. So in terms of kind of the balance between user privacy and business pragmatism, I wondered if you could just talk a bit about how you, but also the other regulators that are part of the forum you mentioned. And so for those who don't know, that includes obviously yourselves and the CMA, but also the financial conduct and the media regulators in the UK. How are you thinking about that balance? And do you think that balance can be improved?
So I think so the UK government, so in some of the statements, Chrissy, you've mentioned that John Whittingdale and others from the government have made, I think they're being clear that yes, they're committed to high standards, but they're committed to adequacy as well, data adequacy in GDPR terms, which is also critical. But they're also open to reform, and it's obviously up to government to contemplate if there's any changes they want to make to the regime. And I think government has, in its response to our national data strategy and the comments made around that by John Whittingdale and others, being clear on their plans there. And so it's up to government to kind of have a think through that. But that's something which we stand ready to engage with as a regulator, keeping in mind that it's up to government to make those changes and decide those changes, and us to regulate. It's something we are very conscious of. It is an interesting choice of words. We didn't used to think we were an economic regulator. And I think in terms of some economist sides, they probably would object to us being defined as an economic regulator. And at the same time, in the last few years, we've increasingly found ourselves working very closely with the economic regulators. And we all recognize now that questions of data and digital are intertwined with the economy. So yes, the interplay is there. And the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum is very much a recognition that those boundaries have collapsed. So when we are looking at questions around, let's say, large technology platforms and how they are using personal data profiles to personalize services, to target advertising, to find insights about people for other products and services they have, the CMA is just as interested in how the very same data sets are being used to exercise market power. And we're looking at the same sets of noughts and ones sitting on the same servers wherever they are in the world for different objectives and interests. So we do need to be much more joined up about that. Now, like I say, going back to my very first comment, what we're looking to do right now is say, okay, within the statute we have and the objectives and priorities and restrictions we have, how do we maximize our efficiency, our competency, our capability, our effectiveness, between ourselves? We also submitted another, and this is all published and available online. We also submitted another document to government at the same time as sharing our work plan for the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, talking about some options that could be contemplated by government for further legislation that would change how we work together, and talking about different duties to inform and cooperate and consult and those kind of things. So there could be more that could be done by government if we wanted to legislate in this area. And in the meantime, we're just going to try and do everything we can to work together collaboratively to make sure that the UK has a stable, well understood, robust digital regulatory landscape where people want to come and do business and people can feel safe and secure and they're protected in their online lives.
Maybe before the team cut off my electricity, because we're getting close to overtime, anything you can share or be willing to give away about the state of play on the ICO's investigation into RTB, EdTech and RTB?
Well, in a way, it's not much that it's kind of what we've said publicly already, that basically we're the phase of work we are now at within is a series of audits of different players in the UK digital advertising industry with one eye on data management platforms and really trying both to understand how data processing and data sharing is working by different players in the industry, and also to learn from that, what's going on in the industry. And that really hasn't, when we were first working in this area, that was going to be the next stage of work. We paused it for COVID because we were diverted resources onto more urgent matters, and then we unpaused that work and carried on. And in that respect, the direction of travel for us hasn't changed much. And the concerns that we had going back to our June 2019 report, those themes are still very, very apparent. Everyone here will be familiar with supply chain and security and lawful basis and all those good things. At the same time, and I'm sure again it's been much discussed in this conference, the market has moved on massively. The overall advertising and marketing world is very different in terms of focus and budget and technologies. And what's going on in terms of different initiatives with some of the large technology platforms has changed as well. So we know the world has moved on, but in some ways our underlying concerns haven't moved on pretty much. So we're pursuing our audit program. So that's very much, we have to be very careful there, Tony, as to what we say, because in that audit program, we're using our regulatory powers. And as such, we need to make sure we follow due process and that we're fair and that, we go through the right steps. Because if we didn't, then, that would not be fair on the organizations we're auditing, and it might impinge what we can do later. So I'm sorry to give you a boring regulator's answer on that. I like talking about these things, but that's where we are right now.
I think it's helpful for everyone listening to be reminded of where it stands. So thank you. Christy, any final?
No, I think Simon's touched on pretty much everything. I mean, I guess perhaps a broader question, just not specifically on the investigation, but just, I know you've talked and the other regulators in the forum a lot about stakeholder engagement and how important that is and putting a real focus on that. And is there anything more you can say about what we might expect to see on that in the coming months?
I think there may be times where in the UK, the DRCF it engages as the DRCF, because only really, but you've got to remember that, like I say, this is a kind of voluntary group. It has its own, put resources into it, and it has its own team, but it's still, you know, it doesn't have its own legal personality or anything or such. So the majority of engagement will still go through the individual regulators. Now, there might, if all the 4 regulators involved all find it useful to have some engagement together, then that's great, and we may well do that on some occasions. But I wouldn't expect too much in terms of engagement. The DRCF is mainly focused on how we best work together as regulators and solve common problems and develop common positions, rather than looking to go to the outside world and do lots and lots of engagement.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Simon.
All right, now I think we got the hook. Constantine looks serious now. Listen, it's really kind of you to take the time and join us today. So thanks for a lot of information, rich answers and thinking, and nice to see you. And take care.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Christy. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Well,
Bye.
and a big thank you to not only to Simon, but of course to Christy and
Yes.
Tony for leading this. You know, with such very interesting conversations, you know, we're always slightly short on time, but long on substance. So this is good. So warmest thanks. And moving on swiftly to stay with the time. And whilst we're on the theme, of the priorities for data protection authorities, I'd like to welcome Arman Eslo, a representative of one of the EU's leading data protection authorities, France's Commission Nationale de l'Informatique et des Libertés, more commonly known as the CNIL. Now, Armand has extensive experience in IT, security, advertising, and data protection, and has been leading the CNIL's Technology Experts Department since 2019, which means, needless to say, that he has been essential in developing CNIL's technological resources that enable it to effectively monitor and enforce EU privacy and data protection rules and establish itself as a leader among European data protection authorities. Armand will now briefly present some of the work CNIL has been doing concerning the digital advertising sector and what's to come in the near future. So, Armand, bienvenue, and over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you for this introduction. We have a short time slot, so I'm going to show some slides, and then we'll have some room for questions, of course. So we're going to discuss about consent tracking and the digital advertising ecosystem from 2009, since the second version of the Privacy Directive to 2029. On next slide, there is a quick summary of what we've been doing in the last decade, very quick. We've had a first recommendation made by the CNIL in December 2013, a recommendation on cookies and other trackers. The goal of this recommendation was to explain to controllers, to publishers, and to the whole ecosystem what was required under the French transposition of the Privacy Directive. We repealed this recommendation in 2009, in July 2019, when we published a new cookie guidelines following the entry into force of the Gdpr. This guidelines was complemented in October 2020 by also a new recommendation and we also had to update our 2019 guidelines because we had faced some challenge at the French High Court and had to modify some of the issues we were dealing with in the guidelines. And then the last milestone is at the beginning of April, when the end of the 6 months tolerance period took place, meaning that since last April, everyone has to be compliant, and we are enforcing those rules. On the next slide, I will be explaining the difference between the recommendation and the guidelines. Basically, the guidelines recalls the applicable obligations. It must be followed by controllers. The guidelines itself does not create new legal obligations, but it compiles all the legal obligations, whether they come from the GDPR or for the French implementation of the privacy directive. On the other hand, the recommendation explains how controllers can comply with the legal obligations. It gives example on how to comply with the law, and the overall goal is to give legal certainty to controllers. Of course, there are a huge amount of controllers and publishers which are subject to those obligations, to the obligations to obtain consent to the use of cookies. And we face lots of different types of controllers. Some of them are very well aware of their obligations, some of them are not. So we put a lot of effort into building this recommendation in order to clearly explain to controllers, to publishers, what they have to do on the website and what they have to do when they're using cookies, non-insertional cookies. On the next slide, I'm recalling what the CNIL has done since the beginning of the year. We have participated in a dozen webinars on cookies. The goal was to explain to the whole ecosystem what they had to do. More than 900 people registered for those webinars. Those webinars were organized with 27 companies and professional associations. We also built up an FAQ on the website with the most common questions that were asked in those webinars. And we're currently discussing with the French TV network and ISP because they're starting to serve targeted advertisement on TV, and we have offered our guidance and in order to explain then how consent should be obtained in this context. So overall, we've really put a lot of efforts into explaining the ecosystem, what they had to do. And of course, this is something that now is quite important since we're reaching the enforcement phase. On the next slide, just a simple slide to recall everyone the interaction between the GDPR and e-privacy, which are two different pieces of legislation. They kind of overlap, of course, on some items, because in lots of cases, reading and writing information in a terminal will lead to the processing of personal data, and then we have an overlapping of the obligations of e-privacy and the GDPR. But we also have some cases where e-privacy only applies. And what is important to recall is that when we're dealing with a strictly GDPR, then we have the one-stop shop mechanism and the lead authority jurisdiction. When we're under e-privacy, there is no lead authority and one-stop shop mechanism, meaning that the CNIL has jurisdiction to enforce the use of cookies. And when there is an overlap, the French law gives us the possibility to either do enforcement based on the GDPR, and then in this case, we'll have one-stop shop and lead authority, or to solely rely on e-privacy, in which case we will be independent and we do not need to go into the consistency mechanism. On the next slide, I've highlighted the three important decisions that regarding enforcement in the last year. We've had the Google sanction regarding cookies for 100 million euros. We also had a sanction against Amazon for 45 million euros. And we also had a sanction against Carrefour France and Carrefour Bank, French companies, for a total of 3 million euros. In all the cases, the sanction was based, at least partly, because cookies were used and there was no proper consent. What has to be recalled at this stage is that those sanctions were issued before the end of the let's say probation 6 months tolerance period that we had allowed controller in order to allow them to put themselves into compliance, meaning that even though those procedures in some cases can be closed, it does not mean that the controllers are fully compliant with the current applicable and currently enforced obligations. But since those sanctions were issued before, they were based on the 2013 recommendation, and it was the non-compliance with this recommendation that was sanctioned here. In the next slide, we'll be seeing what we are intending to do in the next year. In last March, we announced that cookies were one of the priority for enforcement in next year. Just yesterday, it's quite fresh news. We announced that we had issued formal notices to 20 companies for not obtaining a proper consent. We've asked them to put themselves into compliance within 1 month, and if it's not the case, this might lead to fines. We have not released yet at this stage the name of the companies that were issued those formal notices. But if they do not put themselves into compliance and that we open a sanction procedures, we might make it public. So this will be settled in the following weeks. Clearly, we intend to target all the actors in the ecosystem, not just the publishers. The publishers have a key role to play in the overall consent collection, but of course, all the actors have their part to do. And so we are fully aware that there are several types of actors with different responsibilities, and we intend to target in our enforcement actions all the type of actors to make sure that everyone puts itself into compliance and that no actor is able to let's say, put the burden contractually on another actor in the ecosystem without taking part in the global solution. Clearly, our goal is to push the whole ecosystem toward compliance. And well, that's why we have announced that enforcement on cookies will be a priority for next year. On the next slide, just a few elements of our strategy. We intend to target publishers from both public and the private sectors. Of course, we have a very strict policy regarding complaints from individual. The law obliges us to deal with their complaints and to investigate. So when we will have complaints from individuals and there is a non-compliance, this will lead to enforcement actions. Also, in last February, we launched a cookie observatory, which is a new tool that some of you might have seen. Basically, we're scanning the websites and analyzing what we're doing regarding cookies. Like, for example, do they drop cookies when you first access the website? Who dropped the cookies? We're making statistics. And based on those analyses that we've made, if I remember well, on the top 1,000 websites of most used French websites, we've sent to the top 100 publishers that were relying on third-party cookies a letter reminding them their obligations. And well, of course, it's not a formal notice, it's not a sanction, it's just a friendly letter to remind them their obligations and to tell them that well, we've seen that they're using third-party cookies and that we'd like them to make sure that they obtain proper consent. We've also sent a little more than 50 letters to publishers from public sector to make sure that both public and private sector are aware of their obligations and that they put themselves into compliance. And we're thinking about using new enforcement tools. Those letters that I just mentioned, it's something new at the CNIL, something we didn't do before. And we're thinking of a various way we can, let's say, have different types of enforcement methodology to ensure that we're able to touch the more controllers that we can. On the next slide, just a short reminder about the technical side. Clearly, consent is necessary for any strictly non-necessary read or write operation in a user terminal. And we're seeing some increasingly a website using other technologies, in some cases thinking that it helps them or it allows them to circumvent their legal obligation. So here the message is it does not work. Whether you use CNAME clocking, first-party cookies, local storage, session storage, fingerprinting, browser-assigned identifiers, or cohort targeting, in all cases, if you use those techniques, there is a read or write operation in the terminal, and then you're still required to obtain a consent when this is used for advertisement. And now a last slide, which will conclude this presentation. What about the e-privacy regulation? That will be the discussion of the next panel. Well, first a reminder, because we have several actors telling us in France that we were applying the e-privacy regulation ahead of time. Well, of course, the e-privacy directive is already applicable. It's been transposed into the French French law in since 10 years now. Well, regarding the regulation, hopefully the trilogues will start soon. And on this, the EDPB has already expressed itself several times on the draft regulations. There are some things that at the EU level, we collectively, data protection authorities, would like to see change in the draft regulation. And what is very important is that we want to have, as soon as possible, a regulation which will cover every controller, every publisher in the EU with a consistent framework that will apply in the same way in every country, and that will allow to have a level playing field. That's it for the presentation. If you have any questions, they're welcome.
Merci, Armand. Thank you so much, Armand, for this presentation, giving a brief yet very clear view on your work. Now, I know we're pressed for time. However, there are a couple of points where, you know, coming through the questions from the audience, a comment from you would be more than welcome. The first one would be whether you could comment about the uncertainties that are being created by differing DPA interpretations at the EU level, and how important it is to make sure that GDPR is applied uniformly.
Well, regarding cookies, as I said, we have GDPR, but we have e-privacy. At the EU level and within the EDPB, the data protection authorities are putting a lot of efforts in order to have a consistent application of the GDPR. But that being said, on the e-privacy side, we still don't have a regulation, meaning that clearly we have different implementations in different EU countries. And in this case, on the e-privacy obligation, we cannot have a perfect harmonized application. I will just give you one example. All the DPAs are by nature the competent authority under the GDPR, but a lot of data protection authorities are not the supervisory authorities under the e-privacy directive, meaning that in some cases, in some countries, our counterparts, the local DPA, is not competent to enforce the national transposition of the e-privacy directive, meaning that we just do not have in the EDPB the supervisory authority which is competent for e-privacy. In the past, there have been some discussion with those other entities, But of course, it's very difficult and frankly to say impossible to have a really consistent application if you do not have a unique regulation, a single piece of legislation, and a single supervisory authority, in this case, the Data Protection Authority. So unless we have a regulation and a clear competency given to the data protection authorities, we will still have discrepancies across Europe.
Now, a corollary of this, you have said that the legality of cookie walls will be subject to a case-by-case assessment. Have you accumulated some assessments now that could be shared with industry for our edification and comprehension? How is that moving?
Clearly, we do not have enough case law at this stage. Of course, enforcement is a process which takes time, especially when it goes through sanctions and it can be challenged regarding the French High Court. So at this stage, we do not have any clear recommendation on how can cookie wall used and in which cases they are lawful. What I can tell you at this stage are let's say the hints that were given by the public rapporteur of the French High Court, because it was one of the items which was challenged in our 2019 guidelines. And basically what the rapporteur said was that, for example, when you're a public authority or when you're preeminent on the market, then in those cases, most probably you cannot use cookie walls. On the other hand, when you do not ask for payment in exchange of a service, and if a user can find some alternatives of the same time of service elsewhere, then in this case, cookie wall will most likely be lawful. But well, that's all I can say right now. We do not have any case law. We do not have any sanctions yet. This will be up for us and the ecosystem to build in the months to come.
And a final, very brief comment, if you may, concerning your collaboration with other DPAs to share learnings, especially around the work you've been doing with enforcement. How is that working along?
Well, of course, we have a regular discussion on those items, on those issues at the EDPB. We have several subgroups at the EDPB, and those issues are discussed mainly in the technological subgroup, as well as the subgroup involving fines and sanctions and so on. And we regularly exchange our point of views regarding enforcement and what we're doing. And in some cases, there are also some cases which undergo the consistence mechanism, because some DPA can choose to pursue to open sanctions from a GDPR perspective, and then in this case we also discuss with our colleagues. But basically, even though we do not have uniform regulation, of course we're doing our best to have some consistency.
Well, I'm sure we could go on for quite a while, and I hope we will have you back, hopefully at the physical Interact event in the near future. But for now, thank you so much, Armand, for your contribution. It has been very, very valuable to us. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you too.
And now our next panel ties in nicely to this, as it looks to explore learnings from GDPR enforcement in the context of the e-privacy trilogues. And I'm delighted to introduce the moderator for this session, Gabriel Voisin, or Voisin, privacy and data protection and cybersecurity partner at Bird & Bird. He will provide a short introduction to the role of DPAs and cookie walls before discussing and debating the GDPR interpretation and enforcement by the DPAs, and how that critical work could benefit the industry's understanding of the EU privacy and data protection legal landscape with his panel of policy experts. So over to you, Gabriel. Welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Constantine. And I was delighted to hear from Armand and the CNIL a few minutes ago that the French Data Protection Authority is calling for an e-privacy regulation, because indeed, I think this has been one of those long-awaited I don't know if this is a present, but piece in the legislative framework that many of us, especially in the ad tech space, have been keeping an eye on. So no need, I think, to recap or say again what e-privacy is about. But as you've heard from the previous speakers, this is a piece of legislation which goes hand in hand with the GDPR when it comes to things like ad tech, which is very much the talk of today. And because of the ongoing efforts on the e-privacy front, and because of the 3 years of GDPR operation, we now have behind us, because you may remember that a day ago, we celebrated the 3rd birthday anniversary of the GDPR. We thought it would be good to learn from the GDPR topic and apply it in the context of the privacy trilogue to see if there could be things for us to look at and be inspired from. So I'm going to start, as explained by Konstantin, by a few key points of the GDPR and the interplay with e-privacy, and then I will invite my fellow speakers, Elena, Stefan, and Beatrice, to come and join me for some easy, but sometimes not that easy questions we have in that context. So if we start with just a few slides first, just to set the scene. We are often asked, what is the role of the data protection authorities? And of course, they are here to find, of course, they're sometimes here to sanction, but not only, they also have advisory powers, meaning that they can issue guidelines, they can issue recommendations, and give a steer on certain of the topics or challenges that an organization face when it comes to privacy compliance. And obviously, the cookie area is a perfect example of that, because this is an area where the data protection authorities have issued quite a lot of sometimes blah, blah, but sometimes very concrete and useful guidelines on this. Looking at the next slide, one of the challenge we had before the GDPR entered into effect was the meaning and the definition of consent, which obviously is very much needed in an e-privacy context when we're trying to obtain consent where needed, for instance, in the context of ad tech related activities. And pre-GDPR, we had some mixed messages depending on the regulators, depending on the European countries we were looking at. For instance, in the past, browser settings were regarded as a valid way to signal consent. And at this moment, that's certainly not perceived as still a valid answer, because we consider that the browser settings are not mature enough to indicate the true intent of the users. So there've been some ambiguities in relation to what will constitute valid consent. We also had the implied consent model, and I'm sure many of you will remember from the past, and has been abandoned since the entry into force of the GDPR. So quite a fragmented regime, as you can see on this slide. Looking at the next slide and the meaning of GDPR under the GDPR. So nowadays, basically, well, we certainly have a clearer message. We can certainly feel that consent is getting stricter and stricter, with, for instance, a clear message that we need a clear and affirmative action from the user, or that nudging will not be okay. But there's still some variation in the way certain data protection authorities interpret certain elements of the consent. Taking the last bullet point on the slide by way of an example, certain regulators want an equally prominent accept and reject button on the first layer of a cookie consent banner, but other DPAs do not necessarily expect that so clearly or expect that in such a black and white manner. And the CNIL, for instance, is a good example of that, because they permit certainly this option of having an accept and reject all button. But as an alternative, they equally permit an accept button and a continue without accepting functionality with a little box permitting you to close the cookie consent banner. So we can see different messages, different interpretation from one DPA to another, even though we still, and we are now in the GDPR technically harmonized world we live in. I think a perfect example of that, sort of a still fragmented impression, looking at the next slide, is the question of cookie walls, which was briefly mentioned by our CNIL speaker a few minutes ago, because indeed there is a very hot topic for the ad tech interested parties, being either the brands or the publishers, for instance. So just by way of a quick recap, what do we mean by cookie wall? Well, we mean this idea that if a user do not consent to the use of cookies and the possible underlying processing of personal data, then that user cannot access a portion of the site or possibly the entire site. And some data protection authorities and some players in Brussels, especially the EDPB, consider that this approach technically will infringe the spirit of the freely given consent requirement posed by the GDPR. Looking at the next slide, we see obviously a variation of the cookie wall via the paywall approach, which we also thought could be maybe something just to briefly define to make sure we all use the same term and we understand the same thing, where basically the paywall approach is a sort of a variation of the cookie wall situation, where basically if a user do not pay, then if he still wants to access the data, the content on the site, then he'll have to accept the cookies. So it's a sort of a pay or cookie type model that we refer as a paywall approach. And again, fragmentation on this, because some DPA see this as a possibility, others do not see the world that way. So I think there is still that sort of a rainbow of colors or positions across Europe on those key topics, especially for the ad tech industry. And the last slide before we start our chat really emphasize that fragmentation. You can see that from one country to another, the position on cookie wall is different. On the one hand, we have the German saying, yeah, no, that's not possible. Maybe sometimes too German, maybe too cliche, but quite abrupt in the approach. The CNIL was very much in the past in the sort of a German bucket approach, saying no, cookie wall can't do. But they had to revise their positioning on this, as mentioned by the CNIL representative minutes ago, because indeed their previous 2019 guidelines, which had this very strict no, you can't German style conclusion, was censored by the Conseil d'État, which is the highest administrative court in France, in June 2020. And as a result of that and other reasons, the CNIL had to revise its cookie guidelines. And in the October 2020 product, we've seen a much more nuanced statement where the CNIL indicates that it's unlikely that cookie walls will meet the threshold for valid consent of the GDPR, but it's no longer sort of a no, you can't. However, they go on to say that maybe on a case-by-case basis, there could be some room for cookie walls. And I thought very informative, and I welcome this recognition by the CNIL that the Rapporteur Général of the Conseil d'État, indeed, in its opinion, left some useful comments to indicate in which circumstances actually cookie walls could be valid. So probably here room for the future and some light in this debate. With that in mind, and because this is about e-privacy regulation, still in draft form, and about to start the trilogue phase which is this moment where the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the Council all meet together so as to agree what should be the final text, the final wording of the e-privacy revised framework. We thought it would be good to have Elena, Stefan, and Beatrice on this session with me to give you a perspective on some of those odd points of the e-privacy regulation and its various drafts. And the first question, obviously, we were due to address, given what we've said about cookie walls and the importance of this particular point in the tech context, was obviously to pick up the difference of views that has transpired from the different drafts of the privacy regulation, depending on the stakeholders you talk to. With, on the one hand, for instance, the European Parliament saying very clearly that in their view, cookie wall or tracking walls, to use their word, should be prohibited. While on the other end, taking the draft of the European Council, we see a more nuanced approach suggesting that conditionality and therefore cookie walls could be a possibility, and they reflected that in their draft. So clearly a sort of a dissonant message between those two players ahead of the trilogue. So we thought it would be good to have the views of the brands and the publisher community on this topic, and maybe I'll ask Elena first to give us her perspective on this topic. And welcome, Elena. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Gabriel. And it's really, I mean, you already set the scene with respect to the divergence of opinions between the European Parliament and the Council on the concept of conditionality in the context of the current e-privacy regulation draft. But what I would like to draw attention to the panelists, but also to the audience, is I think we should look at the concept of conditionality as like from the text that we read today from the Council's text, and make the exercise by looking at it in the context of the 3 years GDPR enforcement, and now look at it as a standalone, because there are some learnings from the GDPR enforcement. There are 3 years of interpretation through various guidances and guidelines, and I think it is essential to make that exercise, because I personally think that the concept of conditionality, were put into the GDPR context, it is reasonable and proportionate in that it provides with a robust protection against the risks to fundamental rights and freedoms on the one hand, but also preserving the foundation of the free internet that we know today. And to look at some concrete examples, and you already called out a couple of them as you did the timeline of the GDPR across, like, in the last 3 years. I would like to remind you that we were coming from an opt-out regime, and we're witnessing right now almost fully fledged opt-in, granular and specific consent in the first layer, user choices in the first layer, all controllers being disclosed in the cookie banner. And this is just to name a few of them. And what I've witnessed and seen in the past 3 years is that our clients, based on this, on the GDPR development and on the DPA guidances, they have taken significant investment to develop robust and new approaches to obtain consent. They've either adopted off-the-shelf solution, like we have the IAB TCF, transparency and consent framework, or they build their own customized solutions. Either way, our clients, advertisers in particular, but also publishers, they have understood that compliance and consumers' trust in the context of privacy and digital advertising is not for trading. And coming back to the personalized advertisement, maybe it's because I think that is essential to state, and it's undeniable that personalized advertisement helps brands to market their products and to reach out to their audiences. But at the same time, I think we have to be cognizant of the value of advertisement because that keeps the internet open to free and high quality journalism, to good content, free and diverse media. And to the point of conditionality, we've witnessed, we've seen today clients that have implemented hybrid models, cookie consent for targeted advertisement versus paywall, like you already outlined. But at the same time, what we're seeing, it's also a 90% plus consent rate on the publisher side. So I think there is a willingness, and there are studies that are showing that consumers, when they are presented with a transparent way of how their data is it collected, is processed, they are willing to give their consent for personalized advertisements. Yeah. And like the result of these 3 years of the GDPR enforcement and implementation, we learned that in the context of the EU Privacy Directive as well, we learned how fragmented the EU market was in that respect. But I think it is astonishing to witness the fact that now the privacy regime, which we have today, and which is the result of how it was crafted by putting the various moving pieces together. How do we interpret the Privacy Directive, which is fragmented across the EU? How do we put it in the context of the GDPR? It has basically the interplay of the GDPR and the Privacy Directive. It has led to players in ad tech specifically to craft a privacy regime which would put a standard out there and showing to the regulators that compliance and consumer trust is at the core. And one last point I would like to add is the fact that I am convinced personally that privacy regime of protecting the consumer rights while sustaining the ad-supported business model that keeps the internet and small newspapers accessible and diverse to all of us, it is possible. And therefore, my hope, but also I think there is a way to craft, and I hope the trialogue on the EU privacy regulation will reconcile on all fundamental rights involved, and in particular to call out the right to protection of personal data, the freedom to conduct business, and the freedom of speech, so that we'll go in line with the current EU privacy regulation text on conditionality.
Yeah, you, I think, very much calling for a balanced approach, which I'm sure everybody will welcome. Thank you, Elena. In light of this, maybe Stefan, you, as a sort of a representative of the publishers, may have your perspective on this.
Sure. So, of course, Elena already mentioned the key facts. So maybe it's worth going back to the origin of this prohibition of conditionality. Where does it come from? So initially, the idea was that consent cannot be made mandatory in totally unrelated contexts. So a user or customer buying any products or retaining any service, and then in addition to this, totally unrelated to the product as such and the purchase, consent is a requirement for purchasing these goods or retaining these services. So this is where we come from when this whole concept was developed, and today it has somewhat changed. It's more the question of whether you can pay with your data or with granting the usage of your data. So it's a slightly different concept. It's not an unrelated request for consent. It's more a goods or services against payment, not in euros or pounds, but by data. And the core question is whether this should be permissible, or whether data, your data, my data, are marketable goods, are assets, or whether this is not permissible, since this is a freedom which you can't sell. So therefore, I think it goes beyond this discussion about conditionality and the different interests. It's more, are we willing to accept that data are marketable goods, are assets? And then, of course, if we agree on this, the next step would, of course, be to accept that as a payment or one payment option, maybe among others. Elena already mentioned these hybrid models, consent or pay, that you can also pay with your data, or as an alternative to paying in money. So in kind or in money, in data or in money. And I think this is well reflected in the different drafts, the privacy drafts. Of course, the European Parliament, in principle, rejecting the idea of data as marketable goods. Okay. And on the other hand, there's in the recital, was it 20 quadruple A, also in the council's draft, somehow taking up this consent or pay model, where users could decide whether they either grant consent or pay a comparable amount of money as an alternative. And of course, we had this discussion before and many times. So does then privacy become something, a luxury to those who can afford paying these whatever €5 or so for a monthly subscription of a newspaper or of another entertainment information or educational online service? Or do they have to pay with their data? And is it acceptable that those who can afford it can save them from granting consent for processing of data or not? And yeah, it's more or less an ethical question. And the next question would be, how would this be feasible? So of course you won't be willing to have subscriptions for what not for 20 or how many services, online services, information, education, entertainment services you might retain. So what about micropayment and so on? So I think if we want to come to a solution, we would have to tackle the core question: do we accept personal data as marketable assets? If yes, of course we would go with a council draft proposing this consent or pay model, or we say no, this is not acceptable at all. It's a freedom which cannot be, which is not for sale. And then, of course, the Parliament's approach is at least understandable.
Mm. Yes, and I think you really hit on the core of the question here. This is where suddenly, having heard what the CNIL representative said earlier about their yesterday announcement of those kind of a 20 unknown website they've approached and are accusing of non-compliance with e-privacy. It will be very interesting to see if among those unknown 20, we have a cookie wall or a paywall model-based website, because probably, if I was to be the CNIL, and I'm absolutely not exposed and aware to the list of the 20, I'll pick one to do a test case. So watch the scene here. We won't have Armand for a grilling on this one, but there probably is some things on the way on this topic. I should say I'm very jealous of all your backgrounds, because you have very neat, very attractive background. Mine is chaos, as you can see behind me. It looks like I'm in the move. But that background remark aside, I also wanted to pick up on another point of the privacy regulation draft, which touch on the question of what can be done in the ad tech context when it comes to the prevention of fraud. Because obviously we are always exposed to, for instance, a risk of a robot clicking hundreds times on an ad to generate artificially some traffic and then move money to the wrong hands. So with that in mind, we all obviously have noted the sort of unhelpful comments we currently have under the current regime, either coming from the old opinions from the Article 29 Working Party, or more recent guidelines like the one from the CNIL, suggesting that even for fraud prevention stuff, consent should be needed. But obviously that seems to be a bit more encouraging on that front in the draft of the privacy regulation, because the line seems to be moving into another more favorable position. And for that, I thought Beatrice will be ideally placed for the question, given her function at Double Verify. Beatrice, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And what we see nowadays in the ad tech industry related to fraud clearly has evolved from what it used to be. When the Article 29 party was talking about fraud, they specifically mentioned click fraud. But if only that were the only kind of fraud we see in the ad tech industry, the world would probably be an easier place to be in. I think there's a lot of well-reasoned confusion around some of the positions taking on the issue from a purely technical perspective. It's rather complex to pose the issue of consent around fraud, because even outside of the ad tech industry, if you have a bad actor that's attempting to do something and all they have to do to avoid detection is deny that they're doing it or decline the ability to be reviewed, that sort of makes it really easy for the negative conduct to occur, right? So even in the world of ad tech, if all a bad actor has to do is design a bot that just declines consent, and that prevents us from being able to identify that instance of fraud, that poses a really problematic scenario for everybody, not just for the obvious individuals who are involved in the transaction from a monetary perspective, but on a larger scale for the users who will inevitably, sort of to Elena's point, suffer indirectly from the fact that without some of this revenue, the internet as we know it today wouldn't exist. And the internet as we know it today was driven by market forces, not just the publishers and the advertisers, but the users who like some level of personalization, maybe not to the extent that it got to at some point where you feel like someone's following you around. But personalization is something we all want. It's something we all enjoy. I think contextual targeting is something that is trying to fill that gap to the extent that targeting may be under fire with the current approach to privacy and the bar being set so high for consent. I do think that when it comes to fraud specifically, the GDPR already moved us in the direction of sort of indicating that policy-wise, fraud falls under different circumstances. It's a prevention of an activity that is not to the benefit of anyone. Therefore, it falls outside what we might perceive as requiring the same level of consent, right? Under GDPR, it's clearly stated in the recitals that fraud can be, the processing related to fraud can be predicated on legitimate interest. That still poses the challenge under e-privacy directive because of sort of what Arnaud was looking at, where the e-privacy directive and the GDPR overlap but are not the same thing. It sort of takes us into this highly technical distinction between gathering consent for tracking versus gathering consent for processing of the information that might be tracked. That's a distinction that often gets lost in conversation. I think the e-privacy regulation is confirming a lot of the thought behind the policy and the policy rationales that went into the writing of the GDPR. So in a way, it's a confirmation of a legislative intent that already existed and that aligns with reality and logic and the necessary tools required to prevent these type of negative activities. I think it'll be interesting. I think it's particularly interesting that the e-privacy regulation obviously is being drafted by the same people that are also presenting us with these, more complex consent requirements for fraud. It definitely is a head-scratching moment, at least for me. I'm sure for Stefan as well, and for Elena.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I think there is a long-standing tradition at IAB Europe to be Swiss, meaning bang on time, meaning that we wrap up because we're not permitted to overrun. Our panel has to stop at 4 p.m. Brussels time because we have obviously a very prominent session just after ours, and we want to make sure we stick to the agenda. So with that in mind, I would like to thank you, all of you, Elena, Beatrice, and Stefan, for your insights today. I'm sure you are on Twitter, I'm sure you are on LinkedIn. So for any of the attendees who would like to follow up with you, do get in touch. Social media platforms are the means of communication of today. Big thank you all for your attendance and contribution, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Gabriel and Elena and Beatrice and Stefan. You're quite right, Gabriel. Going hopelessly over time is chairman's prerogative. All the rest has to stay fully aligned. Now, seriously, thank you for sharing your thoughts and how we can apply some of these learnings to the upcoming EU interinstitutional negotiations, the trilogues on the privacy regulation proposal. I have to say at this stage that if anyone is interested in finding out more on this subject or other important topics around policy, regulation, and advocacy, you can head over to the IAB Europe website, where you will find a dedicated web page that includes a lot of material that you may find very, very interesting to peruse. And now we move on to our very much anticipated closing keynote address, where I have the pleasure of handing the microphone back over to our CEO, Tawny Fian, as she will introduce our keynote speaker, Commission Vice President Vera Eurova for Values and Transparency. So Tawny, over to you.
Thank you, Constantine. It is an honor, it is a real honor for me to introduce Commission Vice President Eurova, who is the European Commissioner for Values and Transparency. She leads the current Commission's work on values and transparency, the rule of law, and ensuring that the democratic system is protected from external interference. Specifically of interest to us, her portfolio includes work on countering disinformation while preserving freedom of expression, including the Code of Practice on Disinformation, of which IAB Europe is a signatory, and press and media pluralism. Her portfolio in the previous commission, my colleagues will recognize, was DG Just, where she oversaw the adoption of the GDPR, which we have been discussing this afternoon. And she's going to share with us some reflections on GDPR 3 years on. A very warm welcome, Commission Vice President, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. I have to ask my colleagues to collect the ideas which you gathered over this meeting, because of course GDPR is quite a topic to be discussed. And nevertheless, we have now maybe the reason to discuss about the GDPR, because it turned 3 yesterday, and I still remember how difficult it was to give birth to it 3 years ago, and also the time which was before the regulation coming into force, because there were at least 2 preparatory years for everybody. So however, 3 years, this time span gives us sufficient perspective to assess if GDPR passed the test of time, what works and what else has to be improved. And I think in general that data protection and privacy, just like all fundamental rights, have gained in importance, not only because of the pandemic, but also due to the digital transformation we live. Internet, social media, online information sites, and streaming services have become a daily companion to many of us. And as we surf on the internet, we leave digital footprint, including many of our personal data. And this data becomes a valuable digital currency that is harvested, packaged, and traded, and as our today's host would know it, used for digital advertising and targeting. The data-hungry business model often remains a mystery for us, internet users, and it also creates a lot of risks. To me, it is clear that in order to preserve rights, especially in a digital reality, we need comprehensive rules that confer enforceable rights to individuals. A modern approach to regulation with a core set of individual rights are key to the response to the global challenges we face today. This stretches all the way from election campaigning through AI, Internet of Things, to the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen enough to understand that strong data protection rules are not a luxury, they are a necessity. And we have also seen that modern data protection rules are not preventing digital innovation, they are enabling it. This is the main gist of the privacy by design approach. I had the pleasure of finalizing the work on the GDPR. We had plenty of discussions how to design a regulation that will not deal only with the problems of the past, but be agile and flexible enough to deal with the problems of the future. Our answer was to strengthen enforceable rights, apply a risk-based approach, and have a uniform set of rules across the whole EU. And also COVID-19 pandemic put the test for those rules. I have to mention the pandemic because it is changing many things and also our way of looking at many things. So I'd like to pose a bit with the COVID-19 context. To fight the virus or help the recovery of our economies, innovative digital solutions can really make a difference. If we want these solutions to be reliable and effective, citizens need to trust them. Robust data protection safeguards are a key component of that trust. Contrary to what I sometimes hear, we do not have to choose between, on the one hand, the protection of personal data, and on the other hand, public health, security, or economic well-being. Rather than involving such false trade-offs, privacy is a prerequisite for allowing citizens to embrace innovative solutions without fear. In particular, the Commission put forward common standards of privacy safeguards for apps supporting the fight against COVID-19. This helped develop voluntary and secure contact tracing and warning apps that respect people's privacy and are interoperable so that these apps work seamlessly everywhere in the EU, across borders and across operating systems. Embedding privacy protections in the fight against COVID-19 is also part of our current work in developing an EU-wide digital green certificate, which is now called differently. So this is the original name of it, which the Commission chose. Anyway, this certificate will include basic data, such as the result of the test or information about vaccine to help retain free movement of people across Europe. To give an example, the list of data categories to be included in the certificates is shorter than what you would have in your yellow booklet for medical purposes. We do not need all this information to facilitate free movement. The GDPR is not an obstacle to the processing of health data, but processing this data in a safe manner benefits us all. And above all, This is about preserving who we are. Our values and rights should not be a collateral damage of COVID-19. Let me now come to your domain, advertising. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have, more than ever, worked, shopped, and communicated online. The advertising potential is unquestioned. Advertisers were able to learn even more about our interests and provide tailored messages based on them. Personalized messages can play an important role delivering relevant information to us. They can also have a significant influence on how we see others and ourselves in relation to them. Advertisers may use different technologies to provide us with personalized messages. Many of them involve tracking user behavior across different websites and combining this information in detailed profiles. Such profiles contain large variety of information that can expose individuals and show their vulnerabilities. We cannot allow for further Cambridge Analytica incident to happen. We have learned that such methods, in particular the use of micro-targeting, harbor many risks. Micro-targeting as such is not mentioned in the GDPR, but it is closely related to the notion of automated decision-making, including profiling, which can have serious consequences. When it produces significant effect on individuals, it can only be carried out under strict conditions, namely with explicit consent of the individual, or if it is specifically allowed for. We cannot accept a surveillance model to cast a shadow on digital trust. So let me be clear, the GDPR must be clearly enforced. No half measures will do. But I also want to appeal to you, to the industry, as there are concerns about the real-time bidding advertising standard or the standard for data brokers. Online behavior of us, European consumers, cannot be broadcasted widely without safeguards. Sensitive data such as religion or health are protected by the GDPR, and consumers have to specifically consent to their use for the advertising purpose. And I would also expect the industry to not only assess legal aspects, but also ethical aspects and not target people's vulnerabilities. I would like to use this occasion to call on the ads industry to embrace both the letter and the spirit of the GDPR in the advertising industry. We also see a lot of problems in political advertising. This is why I will propose rules that we will increase transparency of political advertising online. This will be a lex specialis to the Digital Services Act, which will govern the general obligations of platforms. It is clear that citizens are not only consumers. The techniques used to amplify and target people with ideas or political messages are used to sow disinformation and amplify our existing divisions. Strong and effective enforcement of the data protection rules, also with respect to micro-targeting, is a precondition for protecting individual freedoms, as shown by the fine imposed against Google in the area of personalized advertising. The data protection authorities are not shy to enforce these rules. Now, the issues related to the mechanism, which is very important part of the GDPR and which we call one-stop shop. The uniform application of data protection rules across the Union has been a major objective of the GDPR. In the core of the system that we put to place sit independent data protection authorities in the member states. These authorities are cooperating in cross-border cases and within the European Data Protection Board. The one-stop shop mechanism is a key asset of the internal market. To this day, data protection authorities have adopted more than 200 decisions following this procedure. And I have talked a lot about the uniform enforcement with Andrea Jelinek, the chair of the European Data Protection Board. And in fact, we will have another meeting very soon after our meeting here this afternoon. To me, it is very clear that the one-stop shop has yet to reach its full potential. More must be done if we want to have a truly European data protection culture. I am glad that the data protection authorities and the European Data Protection Board realize that there are problems and that they are committed to finding solutions. While I believe the GDPR creates an appropriate enforcement model, it requires goodwill and good cooperation. And if this cooperation in a decentralized way will not lead to effective enforcement of data protection rules in the EU, believe me, the appetite towards a more centralized European level model, like the ones we see in the competition cases or in the recently proposed Digital Services Act, so this appetite is likely to grow. But we are not there yet, and I continue to believe in the Data Protection Board and its consistency mechanism. I wish for the use of all tools in the GDPR to support effective enforcement, such as joint investigations or mutual assistance. Let me also touch upon the sensitive issue of international transfers. The question is how to effectively protect individual rights like privacy in our borderless, interconnected digital world where transferring data takes a click or two, and how to do it in full respect of our EU data protection standards. The question has become even more relevant after the Schrems II ruling. This ruling has reaffirmed the need to ensure continuity of protection when data is transferred abroad. Our answer in the EU has been not to erect barriers, but to create bridges, to be open and to allow data to flow, provided that there is continuity of protection. Promoting strong privacy standards and data flows, and thus trade, can and should be complementary objectives. This is reflected in our ambitious agenda on trusted data transfers. For instance, we have recently concluded our adequacy negotiations with South Korea, 2 years after having created the world's largest area of free and safe data flows with Japan. We have also started talks with other Asian and Latin American partners. This is further reflected in our approach we are taking in our trade negotiations at both the bilateral and multilateral level. For example, in the recent trade and cooperation agreement with the UK, we included a straightforward prohibition of data localization requirements and an emphasis on the importance of data flows. We want to make very clear that genuine data protection on the one hand and digital protectionism on the other hand are two very different things. The way I see it, we are facing similar global challenges, and I am glad to see an increasing number of countries are converging towards putting in place modern data protection regimes, very often inspired by our GDPR. This is a global trend running from Brazil to Korea or from Kenya to India. In a world that is often fragmented, this increasing convergence offers new opportunities to harness the digital economy and better protect the data of our citizens. I believe there is now a momentum to work amongst like-minded partners and to reap the tangible benefits of increasing global convergence on privacy standards. This is why the EU is committed to continue to roll out an ambitious agenda on international data flows. This does not concern only adequacy decisions, but also developing other transfer mechanisms on the basis of the broad GDPR toolbox. For instance, in the coming days, the Commission will adopt a set of modernized standard contractual clauses. Such clauses represent a number of transfer mechanisms used by companies in the EU when trading with foreign customers and business partners. An important part of that work concerns, of course, transatlantic transfers. After the invalidation of the EU-US Privacy Shield by the Court of Justice last year. What is at stake are complex and sensitive issues for the US as for Europe that relate to the delicate balance between national security and privacy. But I believe that as like-minded partners, we should be able to find appropriate solutions on principles that are cherished on both sides of the Atlantic, which are access to court, enforceable individual rights, and limitations against excessive interferences with the fundamental right of data protection. Of course, any new solution has to be in full compliance with all requirements of the case law of the Court of Justice. This is not only a question of respect for the decisions of our highest court, it is also the only way to ensure the stability and legal certainty stakeholders expect on both sides of the Atlantic. It is therefore in the mutual interest of the US and the EU to reach a durable agreement that fully complies with the requirements of the Court of Justice's case law. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, data protection is not going to go away. It is a necessary ingredient of any digital transformation. It is a fundamental right in the EU, and our highest court has established a stable jurisprudence on it. The protection of privacy and the protection against risks emanating from online platforms, social media, and new technologies are interlinked. They are all converging on the need to uphold people's rights in the online and the offline world. Europe needs to act now more than ever, and we are well placed to do it in our European way, balancing the need for innovation with the need of the protection of the individual. Technology that should serve the human being and not the other way around. And Europe, again, as a rule maker rather than a rule taker. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for such a wide-ranging set of comments. And perhaps I would only say very briefly on our behalf in reply that we are deeply invested in the European data protection legal paradigm. We are convinced that privacy, correct observance of privacy is the key to sustainability of our industry. We have developed a legal compliance standard that I believe we had the possibility to present to your office a couple of years ago, that is attempts to incarnate the values that you have just spoken of, and that we estimate now is implemented on about 500,000 websites in Europe. We completely agree with respect to special category data. There's one legal basis, which is explicit consent. No two ways about it. Our framework actually doesn't enable processing on the basis of that legal basis. We need harmonized enforcement. We absolutely need harmonized enforcement. So we appreciate your investment in and support for that. And it has been really interesting to see the sort of opening to more centralized enforcement in the DSA and DMA proposals, and to contemplate what lesson appears to be being learned from the GDPR experience. I think there's more convergence actually than sometimes is said. But it's definitely still a work in progress. So thanks again for a wonderful and very complete exposition, and I hand back to the host.
Well, thank you, Tony, and permit me to add my sincere and warmest thank yous to Commission Vice President Eurova. It was truly a privilege to have you with us today, Commission Vice President, and we hope to continue our engagement and dialogue with EU institutions and, of course, yourself. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye.
So we're almost at the end now of day 2 of Interact, and we hope you found it as valuable and enjoyable as we have. Don't forget that tomorrow we start at 12 o'clock CET for the final day of Interact, where we'll be discussing standards and frameworks with a host of great speakers and panelists who will dive into diverse topics, including the evolution of the TCF, how can we work towards a sustainable programmatic value chain for all, and new standards we should be working towards. Be sure to head over to ibeurope.eu/interact to sign up if you haven't done so already. And we look forward to having you with us tomorrow. And with that, I would like to thank again our main sponsors, OneTrust, Double Verify, and Relevant Yield, as well as our supporting sponsors, Google and Magnite. Again, all speakers, panelists, and moderators today, the team, Helen and Lauren, for organizing the Interact, and of course, all of you who tuned in today. The recording of today, like yesterday, will be available on the IAB Europe website on the next few days. In the meantime, have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thank you.